And so those three are kind of one unit: the lulav with the palm, with the myrtle and the willow, and then you have the etrog, which is held together. This citron, this lemon-like thing. And okay, so is that indigenous to the land of Israel? Is the $64,000 question? Shalom, this is Nehemia Gordon, and welcome to Hebrew Voices. I am here today with Dr. David Moster. He is the director and founder of the Institute of Biblical Culture at biblicalculture.org. He's a PhD in Bible from Bar-Ilan University, master's in ancient Israel from NYU, and rabbinical ordination from Yeshiva University. He's the author of a book called Etrog, How a Chinese Fruit Became a Jewish Symbol, published this year, just came out a few months ago. Dr. Moster, or Rabbi Moster, tell us about the Etrog. The Etrog, of course, for many of my listeners, that some will be familiar because they grew up going to Jewish synagogues, but many will only be familiar with it because they saw the movie Ushpizin, which has that big lemon-looking thing, and you wrote a whole book, a whole PhD on it. Tell us about the Etrog.
So thank you for having me, Nehemia. It's a real pleasure. Yeah. The Etrog it's good that you mentioned the lemon. The etrog is a cousin of the lemon. It's very lemony. It's a citrus fruit. It's actually one of the most ancient citrus fruits. And it's characterized by its pungent smell, and also it has a lot of bumps usually. Now, it's called in scientific parlance, it's called citrus medica. So or a lot of people call it citron. Not to be confused, in France, they call the lemon citron, which gets confusing. Oh. So people think, that the citron they found it. No, that's the lemon in France. But the etrog is a lemon-like fruit that is easy to hold in your hand, most of them. And it's one of the many types of citrus medica. There are many, many types of citrus medica, and a lot of them are actually really interesting. One of the most interesting is called the Buddha's hand citron, which actually looks like if you took a hand and stuck out your fingers. It's one of the most fascinating fruits on earth. Buddha's hand, yeah.
Like the Buddhist person, whatever Buddha. Well, so before you get to all that, I want you to talk about that, but I want you to tie it in directly to the Bible. This is Hebrew Voices. We love the Bible here. Let's start with Leviticus 23:40, and actually even before Leviticus 23:40, for someone who's never been to a Jewish synagogue before, what is the citron? What does the etrog do? What is the function? And some people might know it as Esrog for you Jews in the diaspora.
I grew up with calling it etrog. So the etrog, actually, you'll see it anytime a person goes to a synagogue in the month of September or October, which is the holiday of Sukkot, Tabernacles. And the holiday of Tabernacles has two mitzvot, two commandments, according to the Jewish interpretation. The first commandment is the sukkah, the booth. And so a lot of Jews eat, and some even sleep in the booth. The second mitzvah, the second commandment, is actually to take the four species, often called the lulav bundle or even lulav and etrog. So it's four different types of plants. One of them is a date palm, the spine of the date palm. Another one are willows, which are common here in North America. Another one is hadass myrtle. And the last one, the most interesting one for me, is the etrog. So Jews on the holiday of Sukkot are going to be praying with this bouquet almost, or bundle of four different species. One of them is this yellow fruit, the etrog.
And tell them what they do with the bundle. Because if you haven't seen it, it's totally not intuitive. For someone who read Leviticus 23:40 with no context, who'd never seen this, I think there's no way that you would get to what is then done with the lulav and etrog. So tell us.
Okay. So from the inside, what is done is praying, and by holding it, what's often done is to pray from all four corners of the earth and up and down. So I don't know if everyone's watching on a video here, so I'll try and describe it. But what's done is the taking of the bundle, pushing it forwards like this, kind of shaking it forwards, shaking it behind you, shaking it to the side, up, and then down. And so it kind of looks like it's a very ritualistic dance almost, but it's not really a dance. It's more of a shake. It's a ritualistic shake that is done with these four species.
So you make a blessing, a benediction, as you're holding the lulav and etrog, and you shake it forward, and you shake it back. And the action of shaking it back is almost like in Western culture, somebody throwing salt over their shoulder. Like it's like over your shoulder.
Yeah, almost. Yeah.
And you do it's not obviously right. And then you do it you do it right first or left first? I haven't done it in years, so I don't remember.
Well, I think every group might have a minor tradition.
So there's variations. You do it one way to the right and then the left, or vice versa, and then you do up and down. Okay, so you put it in the different. You've shaken it to the different directions, and the key part of understanding this for the biblical context is Leviticus 23:40. Can we read that? Leviticus 23:40. Let me pull it up here. And actually, can I have you read it in Hebrew and then translate it? Can you do that for me?
Yeah, let me get. Mm-hmm. So this is what it says in Leviticus 23:40. It says, "Ulakachtem lachem b'yom harishon," and you shall take for yourselves on the first day, pre-Eitz Hadar, which is, we're going to speak a lot about that. But
don't translate right now, pre-Eitz Hadar. Let's leave that untranslated.
So it says you shall take this pre-Eitz Hadar, kapot tamarim, the fronds of palm fronds, ba'anaf eitz avot, and bushy trees, ba'arvei nachal, and willows of the brook, v'simachtem lifnei Adonai Elohechem shiv'at yamim, and you shall be happy before your God the Lord for 7 days.
And what's not clear immediately from this verse is you take these 4 types of vegetation, and what do you do with them? And we'll get to some of the interpretations later, but the standard rabbinical interpretation that you would see at an Orthodox synagogue or a Reformed temple, would you see it at a Reformed temple? I actually don't know the answer to
that.
Well,
more and more you would. Okay. More and more.
So if you saw it at the Reformed temple, you would see it in the guise of, you have this bundle, and it's the lulav is this, it's actually the heart of a palm branch, meaning it hasn't spread out its leaves yet. And it's really interesting. It's woven pieces of the palm branch that then hold together the myrtle and the willow. Myrtle and willow are extremely common in Israel. Myrtle I have literally 10 feet from here outside my window. It's here in Jerusalem. It's giving me horrible allergies.
Okay.
I wake up with my eyes all encrusted from the willow because it's now in bloom, and or it's giving off some kind of pollen anyway. And so those 3 are kind of one unit: the lulav with the myrtle and the willow. And then you have the etrog, which is held together, this citron, this lemon-like thing. And okay, so is that indigenous to the land of Israel? Is the $64,000 question? Because the first 3 are. I mean, palm branches, you could throw a stone and hit a palm branch. Willows, I got everywhere. Willows, you really have to go into the nachal, into the brook. So we've got to walk a little. But date palms, man, we got those just about everywhere.
Right.
But what about the citron?
Okay, so before we get to the $64,000 question, this verse is the rabbinic interpretation, which became the Jewish interpretation of.
I would challenge you on that. I would say it's still the rabbinical interpretation.
The rabbinic Jewish interpretation, right?
There are other Jewish interpretations, which
Okay. Well, this was the rabbinic one, and what happened is that these 4 species became the 4 species of the lulav bundle, and the pre-Eitz Hadar, which either means the fruit of the beautiful tree or the beautiful fruit of the tree. Then there's some nuance there. That was referred to as the etrog. So the etrog was the 4th of the 4 species. Now you ask, did this come from Israel? Which is really
from the name of your book, I'm guessing it didn't come from Israel.
Right. Well, and we all kind of know this. It's one of the core issues in my book, but we all kind of know this. Like, it's never mentioned in Tanakh, in the Bible. It's never, know this.
I got to stop you there. The etrog is never mentioned in the Tanakh, but you could argue it is, meaning if pre-Eitz Hadar, the fruit of the splendorous tree or the glorious tree, if that refers to etrog, you could say that's the biblical name of etrog, right? In other words, it's kind of a catch-22. But other than that, there's no reference to this as a fruit, is what you're saying.
Well, as a name, there's the etrog. The name etrog doesn't appear in the Bible. Okay. And actually, and this makes sense. We know the 7 fruits of the land. We know the pomegranate, the fig, the grape, the dates, the wheat, the barley. I hope I got the 7 there. Maybe I missed one.
It's the verse in Deuteronomy, the seven produces of the land. That doesn't mean that's all that grew in the land.
Not all.
So we have this wonderful a mosaic. It's on display at the Israel Museum, and it's actually about the sabbatical year, and it talks about in the area of Beit Shan what produce is subject to the sabbatical year prohibition and which isn't, and it lists all these different types of plants that we don't find in the Bible. Some of them, right? I mean, I can't tell you off the top of my head but it lists dozens of different types of
right.
things.
And
some of them are, what's interesting is some of them are the modern names, right? Lentils and things like this are mentioned. So it's possible things grew in Israel that aren't mentioned in Tanakh,
it's
right?
possible. I think the carob tree is not mentioned either. So it's possible. But on the other hand, the thing about the etrog is that it's so unique, it's so beautiful, it's so pungent, it's used on Sukkot. It's kind of glaring in its glaring absence. That's the problem with it.
What's really interesting to me is that we have this word etrog. What language is the word etrog in?
Well, etrog actually is an Aramaic word, which comes from the Persian dialect wadrang. And from wadrang, it was actually called different things before it got to Persia, which is actually now we're answering your question, is where did it come from? So let's kind of start from the beginning and we'll get to
Let me stop you for a second. So I'm looking at Leviticus 23:40 in the Targum, and it has the word atrogin, right? So in other words, this word is not a modern word for it. This is the ancient word for this fruit, at least in Aramaic, in the Targum. And if that was the word in biblical Hebrew, you'd wonder why doesn't it use that word? Although, like we said, that doesn't really prove definitively. For example, some people argue that the word tarnagol, which is way off topic, guys, but tarnagol is the word for chicken or rooster. And there's an animal mentioned in the book of Job, sechvi, which some people interpret as referring to the rooster. We could debate whether that's correct or not. But it's possible that there was a biblical Hebrew name that then was replaced with some later Hebrew word. So maybe Priet Sadar, fruit of the splendorous tree, is the biblical. Maybe Moses was holding one in his hand, and what everybody called that at the fruit market in the desert was Priet Sadar. How do we know that? How do we know that's not correct? I'm going to play the rabbinical advocate here.
Well, that's fine. That's fine. And I've heard this argument a lot. So the first thing is Moses did not have an etrog, and I'm going to explain why. The first one is the reason I'm going to explain this is we're going to start with the historical aspect of the etrog, and then the next one we're going to talk about the historical aspect of the biblical text. Okay? So let's start with the history of the etrog. So it was really interesting in the last century. Botanists started asking the question of where do fruits and plants come from?
Okay.
A basic question, where do fruits and plants come from? And they've started looking at, where is there the most genetic diversity? And another question they asked is, where on earth were parasites evolving just for that fruit alone? Because if this plant was in there for so long, then the parasites would evolve to make use of that plant. And then finally, in the last 50 or so years, or even more, we started looking at DNA. And you can actually trace the family tree of fruits and see kind of way back where the ancestors come from. So the etrog, like all citrus fruits, comes from the region of southern China, northeastern India, and the region there. There are a lot of countries in that area. And it comes from that area. So all lemons, limes, kumquats, grapefruits, everything, you name it.
Now you're just making up words. No, I'm kidding.
No. The kumquat is a delicious fruit.
My sister here in Jerusalem has a kumquat tree in her, or it might be a loquat actually, but it's one of those quat trees in her yard. Meaning, so they do grow in Israel. We're known for our citrus fruit here in Israel.
It grows very well. It grows very well in Israel, especially if you water it. Especially, so all these fruits actually come from the region of China. And when I say China, I mean this general region, Indochina and so on and so forth, not referring to any modern borders.
East Asia, basically.
East Asia, but in that region, the region is actually called Yunnan. And it's famous because, have you ever heard of the...
I visited Yunnan. I went there during Chinese New Year in
my goodness.
So 2014. I've been to... I was in Kunming and Xishangbana. And the last surviving rainforest in China is just outside of Bana. So
and so did you see the large valleys, the steep hills?
Oh yeah. I climbed some of those steep hills. Right. It was incredible because today what they were doing is cutting down the rainforest and replacing it with tea plantations because they get no money for tea. And I would watch these people go to work and they would climb a hill like that was their morning. I mean, that wasn't even their morning, right? It was the first part of their morning was just walking up this hill that would be my hike for the day.
Right.
And that was just the morning to prune some tree up there and then they go to another hill. And it's really incredible how they do that.
Yeah.
I guess they have mountain legs, which I don't. So yeah.
Well, this area, because it has such steep mountain hills and valleys, it's actually a really great place for evolutionary purposes. So what would happen is a fruit in one valley would be completely cut off from the next valley. So in one valley, you might have, let's say, a kumquat, but in the next valley, you're going to get a lime, because the mountains are so high. And so actually this was also a famous place because it was the inspiration for Shangri-La in the book Lost Horizon. So because it was this beautiful place just off the Himalayas. So this is where, in the region of the world where citrus fruits come from, and we know other fruits come from different places. Do you ever hear avocados from Mexico? They actually come from Mexico, right?
Do they really? They're native there?
Yeah, they're native there.
Can I bring an analogy here?
Yeah.
So we have potatoes all over the world, and Ireland is known for potatoes. Russia's actually known for potatoes. But where does the potato come from? I believe it comes from South America. And in South America, you have dozens of types of potato, right? Whereas essentially in Russia, it's like more or less a monoculture of maybe one type or two or three types. You have dozens of types. So that's the biodiversity you're talking about. And one of the things I know from the field of studying wheat and barley, and I don't know if this is the same, correct me here if this is different, but one of the things they looked for was the wild wheat and the wild barley. In other words, they said the place where it was domesticated, there must still exist the wild wheat. And it was in, I believe, 1909 that Israel Aronson, who won some kind of international acclaim for this, he discovered the wild wheat on the terraces outside Rosh Pinah in northern Israel. And up until then, nobody knew where wheat was really domesticated. Nobody really knew. They had theories and beliefs. But until he found the wild wheat, he couldn't say, okay, it had to be domesticated in this area because this is where the wild cousin still lives. So do we have something like that with the Etrog?
Well, meaning a place where it's still growing in the wild?
No, where there's wild. I think, from what I understand, Etrog doesn't grow in the wild anywhere, but is there wild? Are there wild citruses? Oh, there's wild Etrog?
Oh yeah, there's many types. It seems almost every time a botanist goes into Yunnan really looking, they find another type of Citrus medica of Etrog.
So you're saying there's wild Etrogs. Okay.
Yes.
So that's clear proof as one could hope for from my
perspective. And not just one kind. There's actually about 20 that we know of, different types. There's different types of Citrus medica. So basically it's a little complicated.
Why is it called medica? That sounds like medicine. Obviously, right?
Right. So it actually does have medicinal properties, but medica actually comes from the meads, madai. So it's the meads because the Etrog was making its way over to the west. Yeah. Okay. So basically, one of the things you were asking about the Bible was, well, hey, it's not mentioned, but maybe it was there. And I would just like to point out 2 points. The first point is that the Bible mentions fruits hundreds of times. Hundreds. Grapes are mentioned hundreds of times. Olives, dozens easily. Figs, dates, everything. They're mentioned.
Can I tell you what I can't figure out is the pomegranate? So we have 7 species which are the main produce of the land of Israel. One of them is the limon, the pomegranate. Really?
Well, it's delicious,
It's delicious, but what do you? So you make wine out of it, I guess.
You eat it,
you eat it fresh, and if you don't eat it fresh, it's ruined in a few weeks or months, maybe. So you make wine to preserve it. But was it really that important of a product? And
a lot of things were ruined quickly. You slaughtered a goat, you had about 24 hours to eat it. So
but wheat you can preserve for years.
Right. Some things you preserve, others are more special.
Dates, which aren't mentioned in the 7, but probably are the honey mentioned.
No, dates are mentioned. Yeah, dates are part of the 7. Yeah.
Let's read what the list of the 7 produces of the land.
There are a few different lists. Make sure you get the 7 one.
No, the one with 7 is Deuteronomy 8, verse 8. It says, Eretz chita u'se'ora v'gefen u'te'ena v'rimon eretz zet shemen u'dvash. A land of wheat and barley and vine and fig and pomegranate, a land of olive oil and honey. And many people say their honey refers to date honey, or what we call Ceylon, because once again you could dry out the dates, but the one of the best ways to preserve these dates and get them past a few weeks of being eaten by bugs is you turned it into a syrup, and then you can do almost anything with that syrup. It lasts almost forever. It's
right. So that's the general interpretation of that verse, right?
Yeah, that's. I mean, maybe you have a different interpretation, but which is we'd love to hear.
No, yeah, that it's the date.
Okay, right. So the point is, pomegranate's mentioned there. There's no citron, but there were other fruits in the land of Israel. Right. One of the native plants to Israel is scallions, also known as green onions, and it's named after the city of Ashkelon. Hence, scallion is So we have stuff in Israel that isn't necessarily mentioned, although I think it's mentioned in the Tanakh under Batzal. But okay,
right, okay. So this is the point that I'd like to make, is that when you get to citrus fruits in China, there are many names for citrus fruits in China in their most ancient texts, because this is where it comes from. Nehemia, not to push too hard, but it's an uphill battle to say that this fruit, which is so important to the people of the land, it wasn't mentioned by accident. The etrog. If it's so beautiful and so important, how many fruits were there? There were 5, and the tapuach, the apple, was kind of bitter at that time, at least as far as we know. So, to not mention it, and fruits are mentioned everywhere in the Bible, in laws, in proverbs, in stories, in names, the name Tamar, the name Rimon.
So beyond the list of 7, we have other verses, and I'll give you a great example. Yep. So that list doesn't mention almonds, but almonds are central in one of the stories of the Torah, with the almond branch with Aaron, and then later in a prophecy of Jeremiah. And so the point is, somewhere it would have been mentioned, is what you're saying.
Somewhere, yeah. And what I'm pointing out with China is that it's mentioned in ancient Chinese texts. And what it was mentioned is as a medicinal. It was used really in certain respects to help you with your digestion, which is interesting because when it made its next step on its journey to India, and you could argue that it was already in India at the same time, because remember, like I said, Indochina. But
so what period are we talking about here? Give me a ballpark of when we were talking.
Before texts. The etrog was in India before texts. We're talking
before texts. I don't know what that
when
means.
you're talking about the
like etrog. In China we have the bone texts, and we have by the way, I was at the let's see, it was the tomb of like one of the first empresses of China, and they had these scrolls there that were uncovered in her tomb, and they were perfectly intact. And I was there with my Chinese teacher in Changsha, China, and I asked her, what does it talk about? And she started translating. She could actually read it. It was incredible. And it talked about 2 main subjects. One is how to predict the weather, and how to use astrology to predict the future. Those were the 2 central things they were concerned about. And what was really interesting is these scrolls from this empress were roughly the same period as the Dead Sea Scrolls. And I think it's interesting, the Dead Sea Scrolls were, they do have some astrological information.
Right.
But the focus there is things like the War of the Sons of Light and the Sons of Darkness, being end times predictions, and the rule of the community, Ser Hayachad. So the focus there was just so different. I thought it was really interesting.
Right. We actually I'm glad you brought that up, because we actually teach the Dead Sea Scrolls and the calendrical texts there.
So tell us about that. Where do you teach the Dead Sea Scrolls? Remind the people what you have the Institute of Biblical Studies at biblicalculture.org. And do you have to be a grad student to sign up for that, or even have done college? Like what is the requirements to come and study at your institute?
There's no requirements. Anybody who wants to study can come study. And we have every text. We read it in the original language with the translation. So anybody who wants to really delve deep into the Hebrew, into the Greek, into the Aramaic can come study with us and really learn and sharpen their skills. But people who don't necessarily know those languages can come and read the text in translation, because we do everything at the same time. So, for example,
this is open to everybody. Biblicalculture.org, people, go check it out.
Okay, thank you. Okay,
let's get back to the Citron.
Let's get back to the Citron. So once we get to India, and it was already in India from time immemorial, from the beginnings of time, according to.
Are we talking 4,000 years ago? I mean, because the earliest Vedic texts are supposedly from I don't know that they were written, but they were probably oral. But they go back something like 4,000 years, don't they?
Once we get to the earliest text from India, one of the first time the etrog appears is something called the Samhitas. And one of them is called Karika Samhita. And Karika was, he's most famous for being the first eye surgeon known on Earth.
Wow.
He was a medicinal person, and he had a materia medica explaining which fruit helps with which malady, and so on and so forth. And in his description, he mentions the etrog a number of times. Another doctor, they didn't necessarily have titles back then, but another doctor or healer at that time was named Sushruta. And this is in the first millennium before the Common Era. And
Okay.
Sushruta and Karaka mentioned the etrog about 40 times.
Wait, so you say the first millennium, that could be any time between, let's say, roughly 900 BC to 100 BC. So where within that realm are we talking? Because that's actually kind of important for the Torah context, isn't it? I mean,
yeah. So with the Samhitas are dated different periods in that time. So,
okay.
I can't say this one's 600 and this one's 200
Okay.
or this one's 900. But Karaka usually is viewed almost like a number of texts from the traditions in Israel that would grow over time and be passed down. And it wasn't necessarily that Karaka invented these, but he may have been more of a compiler or an editor and then added in his own. So this is really ancient stuff. And they're mentioning the etrog 40 times. We had a name like Mutulungaka.
Okay. Well, that was the name of the etrog.
Yeah. And I forgot to say.
Mutulungaka translate as? Doesn't translate as a beautiful fruit of a beautiful tree.
No, it's etrog. And
that would be nice if it did.
Right. And there were names for it in China and there are names for it in India. And so finally we're tracking this fruit from its homeland to India. And actually, in terms of, one of the things that's most interesting to me is viewing it kind of as like a migrant, because it starts out in China where all these citrus fruits are around and it's not important. And then it gets to India and there's only a handful of citrus fruits. There's the lemon, there's the lime, there's the etrog, maybe a few more. But, the orange, for example, would really take off in China, not in India. So the etrog is now going up in status, and it's still used for gastro issues. The peel is used, the fruit is used, the rind is used. But also, this is what we're talking about in Israel. Fruits often occur in different places and in different contexts of culture. So, for example, there's a statue of Shiva sitting with an etrog. And he also has a weasel in his other hand. And he's
so that's like the Indian god, or I thought it was a goddess for some reason.
Well, there's a Shiva, and then there's Brahmanic deities that also hold the etrog, and there are different forms of the Shiva. But one form is actually holding an etrog and a mongoose vomiting jewels in the other hand.
A mongoose?
A mongoose
vomiting. Like Ricky Tikki Tavi is vomiting jewels.
A what?
Ricky Tikki Tavi.
No, I don't know. I don't know what that is.
Before your time. It was a story about a mongoose that killed snakes, and I guess in India. No.
Well, the mongoose is vomiting jewels, a symbol of wealth, and the etrog was a symbol of fertility. One of the main reasons we think it was a symbol.
Wow. So the etrog was a symbol of fertility in India.
Right, and we're going to get to why. The main reason why is this is something that most people don't realize, especially, remember, so Jews are the main people who use the etrog, and most of them
You mean today?
Yeah, today. Many, not most, I take that back, but a lot of Jews have never sliced it open. You just never sliced it open. Once you slice it open, you'll see there's not a lot of fruit. Today's etrogim, by the way, the ones that are for the mass market, are very lemony, so they have a lot more fruit. But most of the other etrogim, kind of the ones we were talking about in China, you pick off the tree, they have very little fruit to no fruit. It's all peel. It's one of the most fascinating things to take a giant fruit, slice it open. So if you cut the etrog open, you see it's nothing but peel and seeds. Now, that's interesting because the seeds, it doesn't have a million seeds, but it's just seeds. And if it's just seeds, it's a sign of fertility. Because the seed will cause.
And by the way, in Jerusalem at the shuk at Machane Yehuda, at the market, you can buy candied etrog, which is something that until I got to Israel I'd never even heard of. And in fact, if you would have asked me growing up, most people would have thought it was not something that you would want to do is eat an etrog. Like, I mean, I think now that I'm thinking about it, we used it for besamim meaning to smell it as a spice sort of.
Etrog,
Yeah, at the end of Shabbat. But I never heard of anybody eating it until I got to Israel.
Yeah, you can eat it in two forms. You can make it like a candy, or you can make it into a jam, like a marmalade. Another way people eat is that candy form. It's often not known, actually. It's a nice cross-cultural between Jews and Christians, is that the etrog is one of the ingredients in many Christmas cakes.
Are you serious?
It's that little yellow. It's the only food market, really, is Christmas cakes. And the reason why is because, one more time, I see you laughing, but this has...
Wait a minute. Are they using the leftover Jewish etrogs from after Sukkot?
No. Listen, once Sukkot is over, the etrog is worth next to nothing. Before, we'll talk about...
It's an interesting example of markets.
Yeah.
Because if you go to buy an etrog the day before, boy, it's worth a lot. But if you buy it the day after, even the day after the first day of the holiday, it's prices drop dramatically, and by the end of the holiday, it's worth nothing.
Yeah, it's like how they say the car loses half its value when you leave the lot. Did you ever hear that? The etrog loses all of its value when Sukkot arrives. So it would have to be after Sukkot.
Wait, so that's interesting. So you mentioned Christians. You're a rabbi, ordained rabbi from Yeshiva University. You've got the Biblical Institute of Biblical Culture, biblicalculture.org. Is that only open for Jews, or can non-Jews also come?
Actually, right now we have more Christians than Jews studying. It fluctuates between each class, but we're very welcoming for anyone from any faith whatsoever. We have Jewish and Christian professors.
And you actually have some New Testament classes as well, don't you?
We have classes on New Testament. I think in November we're going to have a class on Philippians. We have classes on Old Testament, Hebrew Bible. We're going to have Genesis, Exodus, Proverbs, things like that. And then we have things that are just general interest for anyone. Archaeology, ancient inscriptions, things like that. That's all at biblicalculture.org. Okay, but back to the Christmas cake was the reason why it appears in Christmas cake and not a lemon is because it's all peel. And when you have a peel, you can put it and you can make it hard, kind of like orange becomes marmalade. Orange peel is important for marmalade. And when you have so much peel for the etrog, it's kind of like a lemon jellied hard piece of rind. Oh, wow. So that's that. So we're making our way in this nice conversation.
Here, guys, the history of the Christmas cake.
I don't know who first thought of this, but that would be interesting if somebody.
And do you know what a Christmas cake is called in modern Hebrew?
No, I don't.
I just learned this the other day. The modern Hebrew term for Christmas cake is English cake.
English,
and it's not uga anglit. It's English cake.
Right. So maybe that reflects the history, and maybe we should look at the British.
The Jews, it's not a Christmas cake. It's just it's the type of cake the English conquerors eat.
Right.
And it tastes good, so we eat it too. We call it English cake.
Right. And I've heard that the Christmas lights in America, when they're sold in Israel, they're called
they're Sukkot lights. They're absolutely.
Right.
They're not even Christmas lights. They're
so there's a lot of cross. Okay, so moving on, and
in China, they're New Year's lights. It's the same lights.
Right. So
they're Chinese New Year. So yeah, all right. So back to this thing that came from China, went to India, and how do we get to it? To media.
Then it gets to media, and we're not sure if it's either naturally or if it came through the conquest of Cyrus and Darius. Because once Mehodu ad Kush, the Persian Empire was from India into Ethiopia. So once they conquered that, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But what happened is it made its way into Persian media, contemporary Iran, and even to this day, the etrog is an important part of that culture's food. It's called the bergamot lemon there, and it's in a lot of different recipes.
In Iran, you mean?
In Iran, yeah. Okay. You can even. I once saw on a website. You can even buy like that etrog jelly we were just talking about. It actually began as an Iranian recipe.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and you can even buy it just straight up in the supermarket, kind of like we buy strawberry jam. They just buy etrog jam. And so that's where the name Wadring came in the Avestan literature, which is ancient Iranian literature.
Which then became etrog.
Right, and then Wadring became Etrog, and so then the $64,000 question is, how did it get to Israel? And here we have one of the most fascinating stories of archaeology that I know of. So there's a professor from Tel Aviv University, Daphna Langet. She's a archaeobotanist, so she studies plants in ancient sites. And I've been to her lab in Tel Aviv University. It's really cool. She's the real deal. And so when archaeologists were digging in a place called Ramat Rachel on the outskirts of Jerusalem today.
It's a 5-minute drive from here.
Okay, very good. So they were digging at Ramat Rachel, and what they found was a Persian garden. Now, the ancient Persians were very into plants. They had these paradise gardens, which became the name paradise for us. And in these gardens, they planted everything that was in their empire. All the beautiful plants and fruits and trees in their empire. But if it was in Greece, which they hadn't yet conquered, they wouldn't plant it. It was only their own stuff. So Daphna Langet sees...
Wait, I don't understand. What do you mean? In Greece, they would only plant...
So the kings of Persia would only plant in their gardens things from their own empire.
Oh. So if there was some plant from Greece, they wouldn't plant it in the garden.
No, but they would say, when we conquer Greece, we'll plant it in our garden.
Okay, so
right?
We'll add they're almost like the Borg, right? Every place they conquer, they add the in this case the what's the word? Biodiversity.
Yeah, the
biodiversity. To their garden. They add it to their collective. And the word pardes is actually the Hebrew word for an orchard.
Paradise.
But it also is a source of the word paradise. In other words, pardes really is a translation of the word Gan, as in Gan Eden, the Garden of Eden. Garden wasn't like they had, tomatoes out in the backyard. The Garden of Eden was an orchard with fruit trees of some sort.
Right, and the orchard, but really the paradise, because it was something unique at that time, would have been more like a well cared for garden, almost like a botanical garden that we would go to today, where everything is nice and in order. And actually, we think that this style, it was a rectangular style. It was called Chakar Bagh. It actually lives on today in Iranian gardens, but it even lives on in the Taj Mahal, where you have that long rectangular pool when you walk up to the Taj Mahal. That actually was a Chakar Bagh, I hope I'm pronouncing this right, garden. So moving back, so Daphna Langet, this archaeobotanist, sees that there are two pools in this garden. And she sees pool number 2, and she says, let's think about this. If this pool was plastered on random day in the ancient world in Persia, when the Persians were already in the land of Israel, she said on the day that they plastered it, there was probably pollen in the air. It got stuck in the wet plaster and got stuck there for 2,400 years. Right? Wow. So she slakes off the plaster. She puts it in her machines, and she finds all the pollen in there, and she finds Etrog pollen.
Wow.
Fascinating. And this makes perfect sense. It's like the luckiest find, but also makes all the perfect sense. This is how it got from Persia, from India to Israel. The Persian overlords would bring it, and then all of a sudden, so now how does it become a Jewish fruit? How does that happen? So the way in my book, what I try and argue is that the Etrog was so different. It was really different. It was different. It smelled different. It looked different. It had to be grown with a lot of water. There's almost nothing similar. It didn't have any real food to it. It was like an unheard of fruit, and it was the first foreign fruit to ever make its way to the West. And the West, by that I mean Israel. It was the first foreign fruit. So this all of a sudden comes, and in the Second Temple period, when it arrived, let's say we can't know the exact date, but let's say something about 400, 450, around that, before the Common Era, which is the Persian period, before the Greeks would come. In that period is exactly when biblical interpretation was on the rise. It's when Jeremiah says that, the salvation is going to come in 70 years. Daniel says, oh, no, it's not 70. It's 770s. And, he goes on and he comes out to something like 490 years. And this is an interpretation. People are interpreting the Bible. And so what's happening in the Second Temple period is They see, wait, it says you should take the pre-Eitz Hadar, the fruit of the beautiful tree, or the beautiful fruit of a tree. That must be the Etrog. And once that became the Etrog, after Leviticus 23:40 was written, and I think, you were talking about criticism. I think Vayikra was written much earlier than many others do. And so after this was written, it became the Etrog. And then
so what did it mean when Leviticus 23:40 was written? As far as you understand,
right? So this actually has a lot to do with something. You had mentioned this to me before we spoke. In Nehemia, in the book of Nehemia, chapter 8.
Let's read that. Chapter 8, verse 8 of the book that I wrote, the book of Nehemia.
Okay, Nehemia's book, yeah.
Write it. So can you read us that? Nehemiah 8:8. And to give the background here of what happened is they had gathered all the people and they actually read from the Torah. And when they read from the Torah, they're like, uh-oh, there's some stuff here that we haven't been doing. How do we do this? What do we do? Or it's actually...
it's 8:15.
What's that?
It's 8:15, yeah.
Can we start in verse... I'll just read quickly from verse 8. It says, and they read in the book of the Torah of God, Miforash, which means... Good question what it means. V'som sechel vayavinu b'mikra. I won't translate those words because they're a whole podcast unto themselves. But basically, it means something like they not only read it clearly, they gave an explanation of what they meant. That's often how it's understood. And Nehemia, who is the Tirshata, which apparently means governor, said, and Ezra the priest, etc., and all these people are saying, don't cry, right? Because these people are crying. Why are they crying? Because they realize we haven't been keeping the Torah. We're going to mourn today. And he says, don't cry. All the people were crying when they heard the words of the Torah. And he says to them, go and eat fat foods and drink sweet things and send portions to those who don't have. For today is holy to our Lord, and do not be sad, for it is a joy of Yehovah, which is your strength, etc. Now, skip ahead to verse 15.
Okay.
So, we got to start in verse 13. Can we do that?
Go right ahead. Yeah.
All right. And on the second day, they gathered all the heads of the fathers of all the people, the Kohanim and the Leviim, and to Ezra the scribe, Ulahaskil et divrei Torah, which means something like to give understanding, wisdom in the words of the Torah. And they found written in the Torah, which Yehovah had commanded by the hands of Moses, that the children of Israel would dwell in Sukkot, in booths, on the feast in the 7th month. And now verse 15.
Yeah, and so verse 15 is really important because they go out and they say, let it be known the following that we learned in the Torah.
Yeah.
Let it be known the following. Su'u hahar ve'eviu ale zayit va'ale eitz shemen va'ale hadas va'ale timarim va'ale eitz avot lasot sukkot kakatuv. Go out to the mountains and bring olive branches and oil branches. It's unclear what that means. Ale hadas and myrtle branches and date palm branches and leafy branches to make Sukkot as it is written. And so what it says in Nehemia here is that all those species, those plants that we saw in Leviticus, what do you do with them? You build your sukkah. And so this is really important. And I'd like to explain why it's so important. And not everyone necessarily appreciates this. Right after the turn of the century, in the 1900s, in the early 1900s, there was an ethnographer who was really there for also Christian purposes to build up a settlement there and so on and so forth. But there was an ethnographer named Gustav Dahlmann. And what he did is he went around and he observed what all the farmers, the Palestinian farmers of the time were doing in around the years 1902 to 1913, right up until the First World War. And what he found was that in the month of September, at the end of the grape growing, you go out into the field of your harvest. And you go into your harvest and you build a sukkah. And that sukkah is made of lots of leaves. And the reason you need so many leaves is because it's hot. It's so hot. So you need to go and rest. There's no trees like in North America. There aren't so many trees in your field. And so you rest there, and then you go out, you take in all the grapes, and then you celebrate by singing songs. You celebrate by eating the best fruits. And at this time of year, right around Sukkot time, is the fruit harvest. And so what pre-Eitz Hadar means is the beautiful fruits from your trees. You go and you get your grapes from the vine. You go and you get your olives from the tree, and you get your pomegranates, which are really amazing fruits, and your dates and so on and so forth, and you celebrate. And so that's what pre-Eitz Hadar, that's what Leviticus was originally talking about, was that on this time of year you celebrate all the fruits, all the work of your
and look,
produce of your work.
That's definitely reflected in the Torah, because Sukkot's also called Chag HaAsif, the Feast of Ingathering, and you're definitely gathering in some of the fruits. And one of the purposes of this Arab Sukkah that you're describing, it's actually mentioned in the prophets. Kasukah b'mluna, it's talked about in Isaiah. And what it's functional. In other words, what's the purpose here? I've got a bunch of grapes out in the field, or whatever the specific crop is, and I worked really hard pruning the tree and caring for it.
Right.
And somebody's going to come in from the Nachal and steal all my fruit in the middle of the night if I don't keep an eye on it.
And not only people.
Oh, and animals too. Sure.
Animals. You're more concerned about the animal theft than the human theft, right? And it's interesting. Some of the parallels to that verse, it actually says a migdal, an actual tower, and it's the same thing in the early 1900s. You can still see them today when you go hiking in Israel. There are these towers. I remember hiking in a place called Sataf, right outside Jerusalem.
I just did a video from there. The Danish coin video was filmed at Sataf.
Oh, great! So probably in the background of your video,
you see the guard tower. There's guard towers there.
There's the towers, right? Yeah.
Make sure that people don't come and steal the produce. And you're not there all year round. You're there when the crop is ready to be harvested, and you haven't finished harvesting it yet.
Right.
And that's the purpose of the sukkah in its agricultural context.
Exactly. And all the holidays in ancient Israel, all the festivals, the chagim, the three chagim were harvest festivals. The Shavuot, the Feast of Weeks, for that you would harvest your wheat. Pesach, you would harvest your Passover, you would harvest your barley, and Sukkot, you would harvest all your fruits. And that's basically what it originally meant. Then, in the Second Temple period, we have this new fruit, what I like to call the Lamborghini of fruits arrives, because there's nothing else, right?
Okay.
This citrusy special fruit, that's now interpreted by the Jews to be the Etrog. Now, other people didn't interpret it that way. And this is something that's very interesting. The Samaritans, to this day, even though they have etrogim in their sukkah, it's not so important. Yeah. It's just like one of the many fruits. The Samaritans, for their tabernacle, their booth, you actually put the fruit on the ceiling. It's the schach. It's the ceiling.
So I want to give an analogy here. So back to Leviticus 23:40, it says on the first day to take these 4 types of vegetation, and it's not exactly clear what to do with them.
Right.
The way it was interpreted in Nehemia 8:14 and 15, and I think 14 is important as well in this context, but the way it was interpreted there is that these are building materials for this booth. Right. Now, how can that be? And here's the best analogy I can give, or I've given it before. If I were to say to an American in Texas, take a bunch of 2x4s and nails and go out into your backyard and celebrate the Feast of Booths, he's not going to take the nails and the 2x4s and shake them around. He's going to build a booth out of them. Maybe he'll build a deck, right? But he's going to build some kind of structure out of them.
Yes.
And I think in the context, that's how at least it's how it's understood in the book of Nehemiah.
Right.
Let's put it that way.
But
they read Leviticus 23 and they said, okay, you want us to build something out of this. That's what you mean. It makes sense.
Right.
Yeah.
But to be fair, there was a reason why this verse required interpretation. So in Leviticus,
I think they had come back from Babylon after decades, and they hadn't been doing this, and they're like, okay, well, what does this mean exactly? Oh, okay, we figure it out, right?
Right. Well, the first one you had just mentioned, well, you should figure it out. Well, that means it's not explicit. So that's the first point. But the second point is that the 3 words that
I'm going to challenge you on that. I think it's explicit, but there had been a cultural shift in time between when Leviticus was written and when the people gathered to hear this in the time of Nehemiah. Yeah. And they said, okay, it's been, centuries. What does this mean? What did this mean in its original context? I don't think anybody who heard Leviticus 23:40 had any doubt what it meant. We might not know what that is. right? But there's no question in his context in my mind that understood.
Yeah, we're in agreement here. We're in agreement here.
Okay,
we're in
perfect.
100% agreement. Okay, but the second thing is that these three words pre-Eitz Hadar, and I'm not sure how deep we want to go into this because you know very well we could go very deep into these three words. In my book, I actually talk about, I think, 20 different interpretations. And I mean that like literally different interpretations of these three words.
That people have offered over the centuries, right?
Over
the centuries. That you're offering. Okay.
Yeah.
So the earliest actually brought in Jewish sources or other sources.
Oh, all sources. Yeah, we have Jewish sources as early as Unclus and Aquilas and the Septuagint, and then we have Christian sources like Jerome, Wycliffe.
What does Jerome say, for example? Because I have no idea. How does he interpret this?
I think Jerome's interpretation. Yeah, actually, I have my little chart.
What's the name of your book? It's called Etrog: How a Chinese Fruit Became a Jewish Symbol. 2018. He's pulling it out. Can people get this on Amazon.com?
They can.
Can they also get it at biblicalculture.org on your website?
No, but they can come and study with me at biblicalculture.org. And I'd recommend me over my book any day. It's more personable.
So the book's like the written Torah, and you're like the Talmud here. You're giving much more in-depth information.
Yeah. So Jerome actually takes an approach. Jerome does is he says, well, first we need to explain the major ambiguity. The question is, what is meant to be beautiful? You say in Hebrew here, it's basically three nouns, one after the other, and that causes an ambiguity. Kind of like in English where we have a big shoe sale. If you say, Nehemia, that you're going to go to a big shoe sale, that's one of two things. You can either go to a huge sale of shoes, or, I don't know what size shoe you are, but
I'm size 15.
Right.
In European measurement, it's 52. I was sure you meant it's a sale for big shoes. There was no question in my mind that's what you mean.
Right, exactly. So
otherwise, why are you telling me about it?
Is the shoe big, or is the sale big? Right, okay. And that's the same thing here with pre-Eitz Hadar. What is meant to be beautiful? Is the fruit beautiful, or is the tree beautiful? So what Jerome says is that it's the tree. But Jerome does something even more interesting. He uses a grammatical. What he does is he interprets it as a superlative, meaning the most, which isn't apparent in the Hebrew text, but it's a legitimate interpretation. So he says it's the fruit of the most beautiful tree. That's how Jerome translates it. So if you want to understand the Bible according to Jerome, you need to go find the most beautiful tree you could find, maybe a palm tree, something like that, and you would take that fruit. That's how Jerome would interpret it. Okay?
You could argue today that in modern culture, the date tree is considered the most beautiful tree. And what's the proof of that? That date trees are planted as decorative trees more than any other tree on planet Earth.
There you go.
But that's a modern cultural value. In biblical culture, as at biblicalculture.org, what would have been in the time of Jerome? What was his solution to that as the most beautiful tree?
Well, actually, this is a great question because for Jerome, it wasn't necessarily important. If I recall, maybe it was in one of Jerome's texts. I think he's referred to a tradition of the Jews that it's an Etro. Maybe it was Aquinas. I don't know exactly, but it's in different cultures. Different things are important. For the Jews of the time, this verse was incredibly important. But Rome was just some beautiful tree. I'm not saying it's not important, but it didn't need to be identified.
I want to bring a modern analogy. So a couple nights ago, I went to my sister's house for the Rosh Hashanah meal, and she's an Orthodox Jew, and her husband brought out the new fruit, so they can make the Saffiano Blessing.
Right.
In other words, the blessing you say over some fruit that you haven't eaten in at least 30 days.
Right.
And it's a special occasion. And so you don't want it to be an apple that you haven't eaten in 30 days. You want it to be something special.
Right.
So traditionally in Judaism, what it's been in previous centuries, I believe it was usually a pomegranate.
Right.
But today in Israel, pomegranate, there's also a pomegranate.
Right.
So you go to the shuk today and you get yourself a star fruit, a carumbala, or you get yourself the dragon fruit.
Right.
That grows and why do you get that? It's not even that. It doesn't even taste that good, but it looks really cool.
Right.
And I wonder if that's an analogy to what was happening in the Persian period, that people see this fruit and it's growing in the royal imperial gardens and it's impressive looking,
Yes.
So tell us about that. Is that?
That's it. Yeah, that's it. And so when they saw this ambiguity, what's beautiful, the fruit or the tree, it started wondering, it must be something, right?
Well, and they didn't necessarily think that was the only fruit it could be, but hey, this is a great way to honor God. If I want to honor God, I'm not bringing an apple to Rosh Hashanah. I'm bringing a carumbala.
Maybe that's how it started, right?
Maybe that's I mean, we don't know, right? But
right.
It's reasonable to think that it could have started that way, right?
Yeah, that's reasonable. Yes.
Okay,
and
now
these things aren't linear.
Sorry, go ahead.
These things aren't linear. Maybe some people used it and then others didn't, and then some people used it, and like you have some cases where they're like in Maccabees. There's a case of
Maccabees. I'm holding it open right here. 2 Maccabees, chapter 10. Right. I think it starts in verse 5. It happened that on the same day on which the sanctuary had been profaned by the foreigners, the purification of the sanctuary took place. That is in the 25th day of the same month, which was Kislev. They celebrated for 8 days with rejoicing in the manner of the festival of booths. Maybe I'll bring you back to do an episode on Hanukkah, and I've actually talked about this in my studies on nehemiaswall.com. That originally, or one of the original functions of Hanukkah was to like a Pesach Sheni, like a Sukkot, a second Sukkot. We had missed Sukkot, and now we're making up for it. They celebrate for 8 days with rejoicing manner of festival of booths, remembering how not long before, during the festival of booths, they had been wandering in the mountains and caves like wild animals. Therefore, carrying ivy-wreathed wands and beautiful branches and also fronds of palm, they offered hymns of thanksgiving to him who had given success to the purifying of his own place. Talk to us about verse 7. How does that has to somehow be related to the lulav, to this bundle, which consists of this palm branch and the etrog? It's hard to believe there's not some connection there.
Yeah, so there's 2 things to understand here. This is what I meant by nonlinear. Things were developing, but they didn't necessarily develop all at once. So what we see here, the first thing we see here is that they're carrying a wand, which the term is used as a thyrsus, is a Greek, almost like a Greek pagan, idolatrous wand, which is interesting.
That like some of the gods hold it, and you have in your book pictures of that.
Yeah, Dionysus, which is not the most best parallel maybe the Maccabees wanted to draw. But what we see here is actually this beginning of holding things on Sukkot. Remember, there's 2 mitzvot. There are 2 laws in the rabbinic way, and the first one is the sukkah, the booth, and the second one is waving the 4 species. Right here, we start seeing the waving. We have other texts, I think, from Pseudo-Philo and so on and so forth, about waving. It doesn't mention the etrog yet. But what it has is this concept of waving. Now, why isn't the etrog mentioned here? Some people want to say, it's because, they were just in the caves in the forest. They didn't have all the tools that they needed to make the proper bundle. But I actually think maybe it wasn't yet part of the normal way of doing things. Or maybe it was for some, but not others.
So this is essentially the prehistory of what became the lulav and etrog, the familiar symbols that you'll see in the movie Ushpizin.
Right.
And that became. And you were telling me that these actually became Jewish nationalist symbols in the 2nd and 3rd century CE, meaning 300-400 years after Maccabees. That became a characteristic symbol of Judaism, of the Jewish nation. Was the lulav and etrog, and we see it on mosaics, and we see it on the coins of Bar Kokhba. But here's the prehistory where it hadn't been fully formulated yet, and they're carrying some kind of vegetation related to branches and fronds of palms. Is interesting because the Christians, and I know nothing about this, I'll be honest, the Christians have the ceremony on Easter where they're carrying the palm branches. I guess it heralds back to the New Testament passage that when
there's a lot of crossover.
That they had the palm branches and they were saying Hoshana, please save. And so why were the Jews, or why are they described in the New Testament as doing that? In other words, what was it about the palm branch that was the symbol of salvation? I mean, what's going on there?
So I'm not of the opinion that things are chosen because they're symbols, right? I think once they are used, then we can kind of see them as symbols. So a lot of different explanations have been used for these 4 species. A lot of different ways. One is that the spine, the lulav, the long lulav represents the back, the spine, and the
Okay.
etrog is the heart, and the willow is the lips, and the myrtle are the eyes. These are all very, very meaningful explanations, but I'm not sure if we could, explain.
So in a sense, those are kind of secondary explanations somebody came up with after the fact.
I think so.
So
Yeah.
what was the original explanation? Like, there had to be some original explanation. In other words, the Jews in the first century who are carrying the palm fronds and saying Hosanna to the Most High, what did it mean to them? What was the symbolism there of the palm? Because we don't do that today in Judaism in that sense.
Right. Well,
but something's going on there.
This relates to actually remember when we were talking about the shaking of the lulavs, and I said it's kind of like a dance? Okay. What I was actually thinking about is at that time period, this Sukkot was very associated with water. And so this
here we go.
So this may have actually been what we would consider a kind of water dance, something like that. And so it could have been part of that.
Can we say it has a magical quality to it, in the sense that in many cultures, in ancient cultures, if you wanted something to happen, and that's the idea of the water dance, right? You want water to come down, so you do a certain type of dance, maybe making noise, hoping it'll cause thunder, and maybe here, like the up and down thing we're guessing here, right? But could that have been the prehistory of it?
Yeah, well, it's important not to judge a culture as magical, but from that perspective, it was a prayer. It was a prayer for rain at this time of year, because remember the rain that would come at this time would last for the entire crops of the year. I mean, there would be the early rains and the late rains, the Orah and the Malkosh, but the rain was incredibly important. Without rain, there was famine. So
you don't want it to rain on Sukkot. It's actually considered a curse for rain to rain on Sukkot, because
you're sitting in your Sukkot. Right.
Well, and especially because you don't want it to rain until you're ready to start plowing the field. And so you want it to rain 2 or 3 weeks after Sukkot. You do your first plow of the field, and then you plant the first grains. But if it rains on Sukkot, we actually just had a rain here. We're recording this just after the festival of what I celebrated as Yom Teruah, the first day of the 7th month. And a few days ago, we had rain, which is extremely unusual, and definitely wouldn't have helped the ancient farmer. He actually wants it, about a month later than what's happening.
Right.
But, we don't control the rain. The creator of the universe does. And it's part of what happens.
Right. You need the rains at the right time. Exactly.
Right. So that's part of the blessing in the Shema is the rain bi'ito in its time, which tells you sometimes it doesn't happen in its time. It happens out of its time. Right. Which is, it's an inconvenient weather pattern. So we have these thyrsus, the ivory wreathed wands, and I'm just going to throw this out there. So 2 Maccabees was translated from Hebrew by Jason of Cyrene, according to the introduction. And I have to wonder if in the original Hebrew, and now I'm just, I don't know, because we don't have the original Hebrew, but maybe in the original Hebrew it had something that was closer to lulav. And he's translating this for his Greek audience. He doesn't know how to translate this. Right. So he translates it as something that they're familiar with, which is the thyrsus, which is this pagan symbol. Could be.
Yeah, I mean, if we had more text, we'd know more.
So now let's go to the first unambiguous reference to Etrog in Jewish sources.
Right, it's Josephus. Right.
Okay.
So Josephus mentions from about 100 before the Common Era that Alexander Jannaeus was pelted with etrogim in the temple. And people were so upset at him that they threw their etrogim. And this story also appears in a different form in the Mishnah, which says that he was, it doesn't mention him by name, but it says a priest was pouring the libation on his feet, which was a really disrespectful act. And so the question is Josephus retrojecting the etrog back? And therefore, the first time we know about the etrog is Josephus' time in the 1st century of the Common Era. Or is this a real tradition? And if it's a real tradition, that means that we already know for the first time definitively that etrog was a popular religious practice on Sukkot in about the year 100. So could be later, but yeah.
So I'm going to offer my interpretation of that story, which I mentioned to you before we spoke, which is, so we have this story which appears in both Josephus and the Mishnah. It's hard to believe it didn't really happen, meaning you have 2 sources giving different details. It's echoing some event in history that they're remembering. And if you take the two stories and combine them, so Alexander Yanai or Jannaeus was the Hasmonean high priest. And from Josephus' description, it appears that he was a Sadducee. And we don't know that much about the Sadducees. It's a bit of a problem. But one thing we think we know is that they follow just what's written in the Tanakh. That appears in some of the sources, and meaning that they without what's called the oral law. And it could be that this etrog was a symbol of Pharisees, meaning they, or at the very least, the Pharisees, the proto-Pharisees, if you want to call them, right?
Early rabbis, right?
Yeah. That these early Pharisees, proto-Pharisees, were using the etrog, and it was a symbol that was something that distinguished them from the Sadducees. Now, another thing that distinguished them from the Sadducees was undoubtedly the water libation, and specifically, what's the source of the water libation? I remember learning this in fourth grade. I went to an ultra-Orthodox school, and we read through, I believe it was one of the passages in the Torah, I believe it was Numbers 29, where it describes the different sacrifices, and there's an extra mem, yud mem, and that teaches, and it's not really extra, right? It's a question of, in Hebrew, you can spell things in different ways. And whenever the rabbis see something spelled in what's called a full way, they say, oh, that's an extra letter. It's extraneous, and therefore it comes to teach us something extra that you wouldn't get from the plain text. And this was brought as an example of we have this ritual that goes back to Moses on Mount Sinai, which is pouring the water on the altar. And I mean, that's the Pharisee explanation. And it's not mentioned anywhere explicitly in the Torah, but it's hinted at the Torah in these extra three letters, mem, yud, mem, the letters that spell water. So if I were a Sadducee in the 1st century BC, I would hear that and I'd say, come on, guys. This isn't commanded anywhere in the Torah. The Torah only has wine libations, not water libations. But we had this political situation where the Sadducee high priest was sometimes forced to observe the rituals as mandated by the Pharisees. And that's actually what the tractate of Horayot is, or Horius, in the Talmud, which is instructions. It's an entire tractate in the Talmud. I think it's the shortest tractate, but it's a series of instructions the high priest is given, in that case specifically on Yom Kippur, and he's made to swear, to make an oath in the name of God that he'll do it according to the Pharisee ritual. And then they ask the question, why did we make him take an oath? Right? The rabbis are saying this hundreds of years later. They don't understand, why does the high priest need to be made to take an oath? And they explain, because he's suspected of being a Sadducee. In the case of Alexander Yanai, I think we have a much stronger case of saying he was a Sadducee. That plays out in Josephus. He had a civil war, which I'll have you talk about if you want to, with the Pharisees. But it makes perfect sense to me. The high priest is being bullied into taking the water from the Gihon spring, bringing it up to the temple on the altar, to pour it on the altar. At the last minute, I just can't do it. And he pours it on his feet. And the people respond with outrage, pelting him with their Pharisee symbol, the etrog. It makes perfect sense to me.
Perfect sense.
Now, does that would happen? Who knows, right?
Who knows?
But it makes perfect sense. All the pieces fit together that we have here. What may be the first, one of the first conflicts between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, at least where it breaks out. I mean, we have something with John Hyrcanus too, who came before Alexander Yanai, but we basically have this breakout into a civil war. I mean, can you talk a little bit about the Civil War?
Well, we could, but maybe we could go a little further. Right, yeah. Right. Because, that's a lot there, right?
Okay, let's jump forward. That's our first explicit reference to the etrog. And I think it's interesting that there's an implication in that story, at least the way I read it, that the etrog was disputed, and that's why it would be the perfect thing to pelt the Sadducee high priest with.
Okay.
Or it's just something they have in their hand, right? That's the other explanation, right?
Right.
And they're both probably true from my perspective. Now, where do we see the etrog show up after that, after the 1st century BC and after Josephus?
So here's an interesting thing. After Josephus, the etrog appears everywhere in Jewish art. Every single place you could look. It's on mosaics. You'll go, if you want to go on a hike in Israel, on a tiyul, if you have the right eye, you'll see anything that's Jewish, there's a good chance there's going to be an etrog, either next to the menorah or by itself. It starts appearing on coins, in the Bar Kokhba coins. It starts appearing in it starts appearing on pendants. It starts appearing in glass. It starts appearing is really anywhere you look. And so the question is, why did this start appearing everywhere? There's a lot of things that could be symbols for Judaism.
Yeah.
And the etrog, why is the etrog and the lulav important? So one of the things that was really interesting to me, there was an article, I'm forgetting who wrote it, but what she pointed out was that in Samaritan synagogues, which there were a lot of Samaritan synagogues at that time, Christian churches, they were clearly not Jewish. The Jews had nothing to distinguish from the Christians. They didn't have to worry about getting one mixed up from the other. But the Samaritan synagogues were so similar to the Jewish synagogue. Samaritan oil lamps were so similar to the Jewish ones. So how do you distinguish between them? And the Samaritans didn't have the etrog interpretation, but the Jews did. So in a certain way, the etrog was a defining feature that made the synagogue, the oil lamps, the coin, etc. It made it Jewish. And so this was a really interesting thing. And so for a few hundred years, if you wanted to make something Jewish, you would stamp it with the etrog. It wasn't just enough to do the menorah, because the menorah, the Samaritans had tons of menorahs on their items. It wasn't just enough to use the shofar. The Samaritans had tons of shofars on their items. It wasn't just enough to show the temple. Samaritans showed their temple. What you needed was something that was different, and that was the etrog. And so in a certain sense, it's kind of the circle has gone, we've gone full circle. Whereas at first the etrog was this foreign, non-Jewish concept. By the end, this is the most Jewish thing that the Jews could find out in that time period. And as time went on, and Samaritan threat, so to speak, not a physical threat, say in terms of identity, as that kind of ceased to be, the etrog got less and less important. And by today, the etrog is really just a symbol of Sukkot, of Feast of Tabernacles. If you go into a synagogue, you'll only see an etrog if you see something for every other holiday. You won't just see an etrog. If there's something for Passover, and there's something for Shabbat, and there's something for Shavuot, then you'll have something for Sukkot, and you'll get the etrog. And so that's where we're at today.
Wow. So that's, I want to unpack that a little bit. That's really, really interesting. So that the etrog becomes this distinctively Jewish symbol, specifically to distinguish Jews from the Samaritans. And look, we're talking in a period, the 2nd, 3rd, 4th century. There are no Sadducees, right? That's not on the table anymore. So who are they distinguishing themselves? It's from the Samaritans. It's really interesting. So there's this concept in psychology that Freud came up with called the narcissism of small differences. And what it means is, look, somebody who's really different than me, I don't need to do anything to distinguish myself from somebody who's really different than me. But it's the people who are really similar to me that are, in a sense, a threat to my identity. Right. There I need to make something that shows I'm different. Right. And I'm not saying that's me. I'm saying that's something Freud identified, and it's really interesting in religion and culture and in politics. Look today at the division in American politics, the narcissism of small differences. I mean, go to communist China, where I lived for a year, and you tell them the difference between the Republicans and the Democrats, they have no idea what you're talking about. But in the American context, this is, what do you mean? It's a really big deal, right? So this is the narcissism of small differences. Right. And so what you're saying essentially is that for the Jews to proclaim and express their identity in a distinctive way, they used the etrog as a symbol to distinguish themselves from the Samaritans. And they didn't need that to distinguish them from the Christians, because there were bigger things.
Right, there were bigger things. Right? The Jews and the Christians at this time.
If you don't have a cross or a crucifix, it's quite clear that you're not a Christian. But if you have a menorah, who knows who's menorah? And it's true. You go to the Israel Museum, and you see a synagogue there, and there's the menorah, and it's a part of the temple, and there's the curtain, and then you see the Samaritan inscription. You're like, what's going on here? No, that's actually a Samaritan synagogue.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the small things, because in one of the interesting things in Jewish synagogues and in Christian churches is this mosaic motif of a bird in a cage. But the Samaritans, at least at that time, didn't want to depict animals or humans or even some beings in light of the second commandment. So what they had was the cage. but no bird. So it's just like
what's the symbolism of the bird in the cage? Is that, I'm going to guess it's exile. What is the symbolism there?
I don't know if there's symbolism. I never heard that there is symbolism. I actually just thought it was one of the beautiful motifs.
Oh, okay.
There's a lot of beautiful things in these mosaics that may not have a meaning. I could be wrong. I never studied it. I never asked that question. I think it's a fascinating question.
So when I studied archaeology for my undergraduate degree, for my BA, we studied about mosaics. And one of the things the professor explained is you would have an artist that would come with a book. And the book would have chalk-drawn pictures. And when you commissioned a mosaic, you'd point at the book and you'd say, I want one of these and I want one of those, and different decorate. It was part of the repertoire of the artist.
Right.
And that's why you see some of the same elements in Christian and Jewish and even
the same mosaicist. The same.
Right. It's the same artist, right?
Right.
Everything's done by the same people.
Right.
And what's interesting is sometimes when they portray exotic animals, you're like, so clearly this person never saw a giraffe, right?
Yeah.
But they're always, not always, but they're often portraying it the same way. So that's where they get the idea that they had like a sketchbook, right? Yeah. Someone saw a giraffe, but by 10 generations later of copying the sketchbook, it doesn't look like, we've seen, I go to Instagram right now and see 100 giraffes. It's so easy for them, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Hand to hand. So I want to unpack this just a little bit more, this idea of the etrog as the distinctive Jewish symbol to distinguish Jews from the Samaritans, because we have this really interesting passage in the Mishnah where it talks about how the ancient Jewish practice was to greet a fellow in the name of God, for a man to greet his fellow in the name. And it says hitkinu. They established this as a takana, as a practice. And then they say, why did they do that? So Gretz, who was this Jewish historian in the 19th century, he explained, why did the Jews establish the practice of greeting a fellow in the name? Like, in other words, you have it in the Tanakh that people would greet each other in the name of God, of Yud He Vav He. It was something people did, but it wasn't something they were required to do. It was just like I say, hey, how you doing? But one day I might say, hey, what's going on, right? There's not a set formula. And so Gretz asked the question, why did the Jews establish this practice? And he comes up with the explanation, which I find extremely intriguing. I don't know if it's correct, but it's very intriguing, which is that the Samaritans at that time didn't use the name of God, Yud He Vav He. They called God Shema or Hashem. Later times it was Shema, and back then it was probably just Hashem, which is Hashem. And so the Jews, to distinguish themselves from the Samaritans, would greet their fellows using the actual name of God rather than Hashem. Now jump forward 300-400 years. The temple's been destroyed. The Jews are no longer speaking God's name. There's a different, Mishnah which says, if you speak the name the way it's written, you have no portion in the world to come. Now, how do we distinguish ourselves from the Samaritans? Because in that sense, we're not any different. So now we use the symbol of the etrog. And as you're describing this, I'm realizing, in a sense, I'm going to go out on a limb here. In a sense, the etrog has replaced uttering the name of God, at least as the distinctive symbol of the Jews when distinguishing themselves from the Samaritans. There, I'm done.
I wouldn't go that far. I would say in art. I would only go in art because, language is a different ballgame, but in art, that I would go that far.
Okay, but you definitely have Samaritans keep the Sabbath. That doesn't distinguish us.
No.
Jerusalem, obviously, but how do you depict that in art? And Jerusalem had been destroyed. The Jews weren't in Jerusalem.
And the two temples, the temple on Mount Gerizim for the Samaritans, and the temple in Jerusalem for the Jews, the artists depicted them in such similar ways.
Right.
It was
building with 4 columns in front, right?
Yeah, or sometimes 2, or you know what? I'm not an expert. I don't claim to be an expert on the temples, but from what I see, it's hard to see differences. They're very similar. Okay. If one of your readers does know differences, please let me know. That'd be cool.
Hey guys, posted in the comments there about I think we know virtually nothing about the Samaritan Temple other than its depiction in art. But okay. And look, we don't really know exactly what our temple looked like. In other words, we know certain features of it. But we have the Bar Kokhba coins where there's the pillars in front. Well, other than that, we wouldn't know there were pillars in front. It's not that clear. There's the pillars in the first temple. That's a different thing. So okay. Last thing, and then we're going to close this out. Last thing is so you mentioned the rabbinical interpretation, and we got to bring up the Karaite interpretation.
Let's bring up the Karaites, right?
You have a chapter in your book where you bring 2 Karaite interpretations. I'm going to let you bring those in a minute. But before that, people can go to my website, nehemiaswall.com. Right. So I sent you a passage from Levi ben Yefet,
Yeah.
who is much earlier. He's around the 10th century, and he brings lots of different interpretations.
Right. And I'm glad he brought one. I'm glad you sent me that, because Levi, he actually had an interpretation that a modern scholar had, and
really?
And
Interesting.
I have to go back in that article to see if he mentions it. But
you might not have known about it. It's not a very accessible source. So anyway, one of the opinions he mentions is the opinion of his father, Yefet ben Eli. And Yefet ben Eli's interpretation was to take Leviticus 23:40 and equate it with Nehemiah 8, verse 15, and say these are talking about the same thing. And in one of them, I have 4 types of vegetation. The other, I have 5. Those 4 are the same as the 5. And so, for example, pre-Eitz Hadar, fruit of the beautiful tree was understood as the beautiful fruit tree, which then was interpreted based on comparing with Nehemiah 8:15 as, and you might call this the broad context, meaning if you take as a given that Nehemiah 8:15 got it right in interpreting Leviticus 23:40, then one way to read it is that the olive tree and the oil tree, and the oil tree may be another type of olive tree, that they are equivalent to this pre-Eitz Hadar. And that actually makes a lot of sense to me personally, because when I build my sukkah here in Jerusalem, I go out and I cut off branches from the olive tree. And what do I have on those branches? I have olives, because the olives actually come to full ripening around November. But right now they're on the tree and they're beautiful. And it's also a good idea to prune them. Right? So you're ruining the tree by cutting off these branches and putting them into your sukkah. And literally on my sukkah, I'll have a branch keeping the sun off on the top, and you'll see olives hanging down. And it's completely natural. It's not like something I set up. Just if you take those branches, you'll end up with this beautiful fruit tree branches as part of your sukkah.
Well, first of all, I'm glad you sent me this, because I've been trying to track down Yefet ben Eli's commentary on this, and I was having some trouble. So thank you. That was really...
Yefet ben Eli's commentary is written in Judeo-Arabic, and it's not published, so you'd have to go read a manuscript in Judeo-Arabic. There's lots of different manuscripts that don't agree necessarily. Good luck with that. And was published... go ahead.
I found the manuscript, but I was having trouble with the Judeo-Arabic.
Okay, but bear in mind, there's probably more than one manuscript of this section. I haven't checked the specific section, and then they say you want to look for the ones in Arabic script because those are more accurate. In any event, his son Levi ben Yefet, he brings many different interpretations, and one of them is he mentions by name his father Yefet. So and then anyway,
so that's one interpretation, is that pre-Eitz Hadar means the olive tree, which is actually, this interpretation went under the radar until 1972, when Irving Kohler, a Bible scholar I had never heard of before and never heard of again, just wrote this fantastic article. And what he tried to do was, first of all, this is the assumption that these early Karaites are doing, is the same thing that Irving Kohler was doing, is saying these 2 verses, Leviticus and Nehemiah, they can't contradict. There needs to be some answer. And so what he actually pointed out was that a lot of times there's a parallel between the word Hadar, beauty and majesty in Leviticus, and a word such as Hod, which is like glory, honor. And the olive tree is in a few places called Hod, the honorable tree. So in a certain sense, that was Kohler was saying, and I think in the passage you showed me, that's what
absolutely. Yeah. And why would the olive tree be a symbol of majesty? This is for our Christian audience. Come on, guys. We're not going to even answer it. Post it in the comments.
Okay.
Why would the olive tree be a symbol of Israelite kingship? Dun, 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 dun. No, guys, post it in the comments. It should be obvious. It certainly in a Tanakh context, to me, it's obvious. And I think it's the kind of thing that you probably would learn at the Institute of Biblical Culture at biblicalculture.org in their courses that talk about biblical culture. One of the interesting interpretations that I think I don't remember if you bring this in your book, but you mentioned Aderet Eliyahu, and I went back and read through his passage. One of the interpretations he brings is he said, hey, the 2 passages don't need to fit, Leviticus 23:40 and and Nehemiah 8:8. These are just types of vegetation. And it's just giving you examples. And it's not specific to these four species. And that's why when we look in Nehemia 8:15, it gives different plants that, it's
right.
It could be, any kind of plants. It's the point
And
is that you're covering
you were talking about what we study at the Institute, Christianity, Judaism, and so forth, is that actually that interpretation was very similar to the interpretation of the King James Bible.
Oh, really?
Because, the King James Bible, instead of saying fruit of beautiful trees, what the translation is O's. And what that means is the branch. So technically, for those who are interested in the Hebrew, that basically interprets the word pre as poare, a very similar word, but it has an extra letter. But that's the interpretation. And that's the Karaite interpretation in Adar Eliyahu, is that it's just saying pre Tzadar just means all the nice trees,
That's one of the interpretations he brings. I think he attributes that to Aharon ben Yosef. Right. In any event, and what's interesting is he has his opinion, but he brings all these different interpretations and kind of lets you decide for yourself. It's one of the things I like about that type of Karaite literature is that they're kind of giving you an inventory, and sometimes it's a little bit overwhelming, right?
Yeah,
they'll give you a certain word and they'll give you 9 interpretations. Like, okay, guys, help me out here. No, you're on your own. Search well in the scripture. Do not rely on anyone's opinion is the Karaite motto. So we talked about different interpretations over time. Fascinating topic, guys.
Right.
We can't get to everything today. I just want to throw out one reference here, and maybe you have something to add to this. There's an amazing book, one of the most important books written in recent decades, a book called Guns, Germs, and Steel. And in that book, he talks about the reason that Eurasia became so powerful and North and South America, which should have been just as powerful in the ancient world, weren't. And he says it's because you would develop a certain crop and it could disseminate across a single latitude. And that's actually what you're describing, that phenomenon, that we have the domestication of the Citron, of the Etrog, and other citrus trees, and they can perfectly flourish in the land of Israel because they're more or less in the same latitude.
Yeah, I never thought of that. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's exactly the phenomena he describes in Guns, Germs, and Steel. And of course, what we gave India was the wheat and barley. And one last thing related to that is, Israel today, and really I would say up until 20, 30 years ago, Israel was known for the Jaffa orange. Israel was known as an international powerhouse of citrus fruit. Now we've replaced the citrus fruit with high tech, with high technology. So that's, literally one of our highest industries 30 years ago were diamond cutting, and I think it was diamond cutting, tourism, and Jaffa oranges, and they would compete for which was the highest in different years. Now it's blown away by high tech. That's the highest industry, but citrus is still really important. And most people don't know why Israel is such a big citrus producer. So, and I know your study only went up to the ancient times, so I don't know if you studied this. But the reason Israel is such a big citrus producer is when the Jews came to Israel in the 19th century, all the good land was controlled by Arab farmers, and they wouldn't sell the Jews a single square centimeter. And finally, the Jews got a hold of these absentee landlords in Beirut and offered them money for their swampland, which was worthless. And they said, you want this? You can't grow anything. You can't grow wheat there. You can't grow barley there. What would you want this for? And the truth is, the first generation of farmers went bankrupt. And then they sent in experts from Europe to try to figure out, okay, what can we grow here? And I believe it was the Baron Rothschild sent in people from Europe who said, look, this has got to be productive land. I'm spending a lot of money to buy this. They paid these absentee landlords many times what it was worth to buy the land from these, Lebanese landlords in Israel. And they figured out, if we dig really, really deep, we can find water in the aquifer. And if we pump up that water from the aquifer with electric pumps, and I don't think it was electric back then, but with some kind of mechanical pump, then we can produce the perfect area to grow citrus fruit. And that's why Israel became an international powerhouse of citrus fruit, because the Arabs sold us swampland, and we caused it to flourish and make it bloom. So it's actually, this whole image of citrus is to this day, I'm going to say, a Jewish symbol, a symbol of Zionism in a sense. And look, I want to end with that. Would you? I'm going to end my part with that, and I'm going to ask you, Rabbi, Dr. Moster, who's also an ordained rabbi. I'm going to ask him to end us with a prayer, but remember, go to his website. It's biblicalculture.org. Whether you're a Jew or Christian, or you don't even know what to call yourself, you can study at the Institute of Biblical Culture with these trained scholars and get some different perspectives and really get some deeper understanding. Rabbi Dr. Moster, would you please end with a prayer?
Thank you, Nehemia. It would be an honor. So the Festival of Sukkot Tabernacles has a few themes to it: joy, happiness, plenty, bounty. And these, I think, even though they're applied to the holiday, I actually think these are important just for life itself. And so to each of your listeners, and really to anybody, I wish them joy in life, bounty in life, happiness, song, and the stability of a sukkah itself. And also the beauty, this would be fitting, the beauty of the Priyat Sadar, of the Etrog, that beauty we should have in our life for in whatever fashion it takes us. So, and thank you, Nehemia, for having me. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you so much.
It's been a pleasure. Shalom. Amen.
Amen.
You have been listening to Hebrew Voices with Nehemia Gordon. Thank you for supporting Nehemia's Makor Hebrew Foundation. Learn more at nehemiaswall.com.